The development of carbon transport infrastructure is an essential part in enabling storage or utilization of carbon. Technology advancements for DAC and CCUS often move faster than the build-out of transportation infrastructure, which can create barriers for developing carbon removal technologies. Factors such as permitting and siting create additional challenges for developers and operators at both ends. Leading this conversation on carbon transport is Savita Bowman, Senior Program Manager at ClearPath. Savvy?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Abby. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. I hope everyone had a restful sleep and safe travels. My name is, as Abby mentioned, is Savita Bowman. I'm the Senior Program Manager for Carbon Management at ClearPath. And for those of you unfamiliar with ClearPath, we're a DC-based nonprofit, and we work on federal policy for clean tech solutions and on the intersection of clean tech solutions, actually, with conservative policymakers on bipartisan solutions. So today, we have a stellar panel, and we're going to be talking about the transport and storage aspect. We've heard from panelists yesterday on the actual projects themselves, how they're going to be developed, what it takes to really get there with the power sources, and this morning with the community engagement piece. So today, answering a lot of questions that I'm sure are on your minds are, how are we going to get this carbon dioxide transported from where they're being captured to where they're being stored? So really key topics that we want to cover are the siting and permitting challenges, particularly the U.S. Forest Service. They, in November, had a rulemaking amending their special use regulation, handling a couple misconceptions about transport and storage, and how some market-based mechanisms, such as offtake commitments, can play an essential role in the transportation of carbon dioxide. So I'm joined here today by Anna Pavlova, Senior Vice President, Strategy, Marketing Development, and Sustainability at Carbon Quest. I'm also joined by Kevin Connors, Assistant Director for Regulatory Compliance and Energy Policy at UND Energy and Environment Research Center. Also, Chris Swanston, Director of Office of Climate and Sustainability at the U.S. Forest Service. So each panelist will go into their background, talk a little bit about what exciting things they're working on and what their organizations do, and then we'll move into a discussion and then followed by audience Q&A. So over to you, Anna.
Oh, sorry, I thought I had like an intro where there we go. Hello, everybody, Anna Pavlova. I am with a distributed carbon capture company called Carbon Quest, and distributed means that we have a very specific niche. We're not looking at power plants or cement or steel, so the really, really large facilities that are over 1 million tons a year, but we're actually looking at everything else, starting from very large buildings that may not be able to easily electrify, at least at the moment, and to a whole range of other facilities that I will talk a little bit. Our technology, so we are a technology provider. We use vacuum pressure swing absorption. We don't use amines or membranes. We use what we think is a cutting-edge technology, which is a solid sorbent. So there is no need for chemicals in the process. The solid adsorbent attracts the CO2, and then we compress it and we liquefy the CO2 on site. And then we have multiple pathways for utilization of the CO2, including sequestration. The things that I really wanted to talk about is that there are some common narratives, and I think that there are some commercial realities out there, and sometimes the two are not exactly matched. So a lot of the narratives around carbon capture are that, oh, well, it should be, or it is, just for power plants and for cement and steel, that it's just for facilities that are many millions of tons a year, that the transport is only by pipeline, and the pipeline is the only safe method of transportation. And I'm not sure that all of those things are happening and are true and very important, but there are other things that are happening in the world too. Decarbonization is not the same thing as energy efficiency, where in the energy efficiency space we could just say, hey, any building, any facility, you should conserve energy, and that basically applies to everyone across the board. What we're finding is that in the decarbonization space, it's a lot more complicated, and there are a lot more hard-to-abate sectors out there that cannot do anything else in the meantime. We think about waste, municipal waste, incinerators, landfills. We can't really get rid of them, and we don't have a lot of other choices for dealing with their emissions, and yet they're very often in or next to disadvantaged communities. District heat systems, think of large central heating for a number of a city district or even a hospital or university. They usually they don't just have boilers, they have cogeneration systems. They have very complex systems in the buildings. They also need resilient power, and so they really can't electrify very easily either. Campus settings, we talked yesterday a little bit about data centers looking for more and more power, and where are they going to get that power? Natural gas compressors, that's not a power plant, that's the stuff that goes along the pipeline, also produces emissions. And frankly, all sorts of other industrials, new and existing, they all are struggling with what do they want to do. These CO2 emissions may not be in the millions, but they are, I would say, in a robust hundreds of thousands, so maybe under 500,000 metric tons a year, but still plenty of emissions that we should be thinking about. And our company is looking at majority of these sectors that I just mentioned. So our range goes from about a very large building of, let's say, 1,000 metric tons a year to all the way to 200, 300,000 metric tons. So that's our sweet spot. And transportation for those actually can be quite different. Pipeline, obviously, is not a way to do that in many cases. And so I just want to bring something up that most people may not even quite think about. The market, the merchant market for CO2 distribution has been around for decades. Large companies like Linde, Messer, Air Liquide, they transport CO2 every day, all the time. It's about 10 million metric tons a year of CO2 that's not transported by pipeline. Merchant market is only truck and rail. And they are not transporting it from the gas field to New York City bar in a cylinder. They're transporting it in large tanks, in large semis or rail cars, and they're delivering it to depots. And then from there is a local distributor who then puts it in smaller cylinders and distributes. Same if you're coming from an ethanol plant in the Midwest. So I bring this up because there is an alternative method of transportation for some of these smaller sources, and that has been done for many years. And many decades, and it's very regulated. It's done very safely. There's no reason to think that we can't do it. Of course, for a pipeline, it makes sense to, if you're close to a pipeline and there's large enough volume, then that makes sense too. I'm not advocating one versus the other. I'm just saying that there are other options. And really the whole point of my presentation that I hope you take away here is that I don't think we want to sort of box ourselves in and say we should do CCUS this one way, or we should do transportation this one way. There are going to be many alternatives developed to carbon capture for all sorts of buildings. I'm not saying that's the panacea for everyone and everything either. But the more this is still a growing and quite young industry, even though some projects have been around for a long time. And therefore, that means we need to really remain flexible and see what other options do we have, what makes sense for an individual and specific project. And by the way, that also goes for sequestration. I know this meeting's been very focused on specifically geological sequestration. What we do with our CO2 at the moment is we actually do above ground sequestration. That means we're putting it into concrete, and so it becomes rock in concrete. It's the same process, but in a building material, and that material goes back into a building. So it's a nice circular economy story too. So we do need to think and talk about these other options. We do also see, even for sequestration sites, I believe in the next panel you'll hear about opportunities to transport CO2 by rail for sequestration as well in places where it makes sense. The most important thing here is that we need to consider time value of carbon. So if we're telling a facility there's only one pathway for you, and that pathway doesn't work for them, or it's not cost effective at the time, they're just not going to do anything. And I think at this critical moment, we should be doing everything we can and allowing people to do as many options as possible so they are incentivized to actually decarbonize now as opposed to wait for some other more perfect solution. Thank you very much.
Over to you, Kevin.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. My name is Kevin Connors. I work for the Energy and Environmental Research Center. A little bit about myself. Been working in CCS since 2011. Prior to that, I studied geology in the University of Montana, and after I graduated, it was the early days of the Bakken boom in North Dakota, and it's the right time to have a geology degree. So started my career as a well site geologist in the oil and gas industry, and then early in my career I had an opportunity in North Dakota. The state of North Dakota created a position called CCS supervisor in 2011 and went to work for the state of North Dakota. I was given that opportunity to develop North Dakota's regulatory frameworks for geologic storage of carbon dioxide and lead North Dakota's efforts to apply for and ultimately attain Class 6 primacy. Worked for the state of North Dakota for over 8 years, held various roles there. I managed the Class 2 UIC program. I built the Class 6 UIC program, and also helped stand up a program to regulate pipelines that were previously unregulated in the oil field. About 4.5 years ago, came to work for the EERC, where I managed the Plains CO2 Reduction Partnership. I'll explain that in a slide here. And I also work very much in the commercial space, helping to develop CO2 storage projects and turning around working with my former colleagues at the North Dakota Department of Mineral Resources. So a little bit about the EERC. We are located in Grand Forks, North Dakota, so we're about 100 miles from the Canadian border, so we're up north there. So we're part of the University of North Dakota, but we have a long history that dates back into the 50s. We actually started out looking at low-rank coals and coal emissions, and then we were also part of the U.S. Bureau of Mines at one point in time, and then we actually were part of the National Lab System at one point in time. In the 80s, the Reagan administration defederalized a lot of those national labs, and we were one of them, and that's when we became part of the University of North Dakota. Good way to look at the EERC is we're very much focused on developing cleaner, more efficient energy. We work in partnerships with industry and our clients to help develop, refine, demonstrate, and commercialize technology or marketable products. So we're very much a solutions-oriented or solutions-minded organization that's through our core values and through the diversity of our organization. We're about a 300-person organization. Our mission is to lead the world in developing solutions to energy and environmental challenges. Our core research priorities continue to be coal utilization and emissions. We have expertise in carbon capture, carbon management, and that's what I'll be talking about for the remainder. We work in oil and gas, alternative fuels and renewable energy, and the energy-water nexus. The EERC manages, I'll mention the Plains CO2 Reduction Partnership. That's the program that I manage. We also manage carbon safe projects. Those are Department of Energy funded projects, various phases to help advance and accelerate CO2 storage. We also have a direct air capture hub that's been awarded to us that we lead. And also we were awarded one of the hydrogen hubs. And then we also do direct commercial work in many spaces, including the CCS space.
Thank you so much, Kevin.
Sorry.
Apologies. Sorry.
Just real quick, I just want to talk about the P Corp partnership. Yesterday there was discussion around regional partnerships or regional efforts. The P Corp partnership's been around for over 20 years. We've gone through various phases. Today we're focused on commercial deployment. It's a 10-state, 4 Canadian province region, but we expand beyond that region and work with states as appropriate outside the region. We started out characterizing our region, identifying the subsurface geologic formations that are ideal for and suited for large-scale CO2 storage. And then we identified the major stationary sources that would be ideal for carbon capture and storage. That led to another phase where we did field validation, pilot testing, and then we did a commercial demonstration. We worked with an industry partner to demonstrate 1 million tons of CO2 stored on an annual basis and the ability to monitor that CO2 in the subsurface. And today we're focused on commercial deployment. This is a very diverse partnership. Over the course of 20 years, we've gained over 260 partners. It represents the oil and gas industry, the coal mining and electricity generation industry, the ethanol industry, gas processing, gas transportation industry, engineering firms, tax equity firms, software providers, technology providers, academia, and government agencies as well. We've worked with Colorado, the state of Colorado, as well, Utah, so we also have worked outside of our region as well. So here's the activity in the region. We've been capturing CO2 and transporting that CO2 with existing infrastructure in the state of Wyoming that hasn't really been talked about yet. That capture has been going on since the late 80s, and there's been millions of tons of CO2 stored in the subsurface through CO2 enhanced oil recovery in the state of Wyoming. And that CO2 pipeline actually goes into Montana, where CO2 is being stored again in association with enhanced oil recovery. And that CO2 pipeline was extended into southwestern North Dakota a few years ago, and they're continuing with CO2 enhanced oil recovery efforts there. So CO2 storage happening, and that as that CO2 is being utilized to bring more oil to production. North Dakota has also been capturing CO2 and transporting that CO2 to the oil fields in southern Saskatchewan for over 20 years. In that process, CO2 is captured off of a synfuels plant, gasification process, and there's a 205-mile pipeline that's operated safely since 2000, and over 40 million tons of CO2 has been stored in the oil fields in southern Saskatchewan. You can see there's a lot of activity in terms of projects under development, and also as I'm sure many of you are aware of, there's pipelines that are being proposed to be constructed, bringing CO2 from the Midwest to the proper geologic formations in North Dakota or even in Wyoming. A couple things that haven't been mentioned that I've noticed is, we've talked a lot about storage, we've talked a lot about other technologies, but when it comes to this, geology is king. It's all about the geology. That's where you see projects being developed. You need to have the right depth because we're handling supercritical CO2 or dense phase CO2. That depth threshold is typically 2,600 feet below the surface. These projects that are being developed are much deeper than that. You need to have formations that have porosity and permeability. You need to have, those formations need to be capped by impermeable rock layers, again, trapping the CO2 in the subsurface. And then you need to have low quality water within those formations, so we're not injecting into something that would be considered a drinking water source. And ultimately, you need to be developing projects that have, that are around areas where there's no identified leakage pathways. Those would be transmissive faults or fractures or any sort of legacy wellbores. So probably more to come on that as we get into the discussions, but I just wanted to point that out. In the efforts here, Class 6 primacy has been talked a little bit. Obviously, I have some experience there. North Dakota, Wyoming, and Louisiana are the three states that have primacy. That's where we're seeing a lot of projects that are being developed. That's definitely a business driver, and it was mentioned by Quinn, who I really appreciated. She said it. Regulatory certainty is a very important piece to this puzzle. Project developers, investors need to have regulatory certainty, and states need to regulate this activity. What we want to see in the future is this map turn green as these states pursue Class 6 primacy. So you have several states that have announced their desire or intent to pursue the authority to regulate geologic storage of carbon dioxide. This becomes a very important piece to the puzzle. Look forward to talking more about that. But I just want to point this out. This is part of the leverage that we have. Class 6 primacy, again, there's regulatory certainty for project developers. The 45Q tax credit, we've talked a little bit about that. That's certainly a driver. The next panel will talk about long-term liability laws. We have pore space ownership and pore space laws in North Dakota, and there's several other states, and then 20 years of applied research and development that has now moved into commercialization of this set of technologies. So very exciting in North Dakota. EERC has actually worked on the technical side with several different project developers. North Dakota has permitted 6 storage projects in the state of North Dakota. The permit time averages about 8 months. And so so far to date, that equals over 250 million tons of capacity has been permitted in North Dakota. We have 2 active Class 6 projects. A third is about to come online this quarter. So very exciting time. We're seeing all sorts of opportunities, all sorts of innovation, and then we're also seeing some new challenges as the commercial industry has emerged. But there is a CCS industry today, and it's very exciting to see what sort of challenges that this industry is seeing, and also what sort of progress and successes that we've been able to have.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Over to you, Chris.
Thanks so much. Can everybody hear me all right? Great. So Forest Service is not a big name in industrial carbon capture and storage, but we are a big name in biological carbon capture and storage. We capture about a little over 10% of economy-wide emissions annually in our forests. The Forest Service directly manages through the National Forest System 193 million acres of forest land, and through our state, private, and tribal branch, hundreds of millions of acres are again benefited by our agency. Now, our focus, as you know, oriented toward our mission, which is the sustainability, diversity, and health of the nation's forests and grasslands for present and future generations, our focus has been on adapting these ecosystems that we manage to the changing climate, also adapting our agency to the changing climate. It's not just about ecosystems, but really, as you've heard, I think in a lot of the discussion here today and yesterday, we're adapting as a society to the changing climate. Carbon capture and storage, industrial carbon capture and storage, that's a big part of that. And so as our agency thinks about our role, not just in ensuring that the forests and other ecosystems that we manage are healthy, sustainable, and adapted for future generations, we're also thinking about what kinds of climate solutions, what other kinds of climate solutions can we contribute to. And so that may include industrial storage of carbon dioxide. Now, we haven't done that before. That's a brand new thing for us. That is an aspect of this organizational adaptation that I'm talking about, where we're looking at our directives that previously have not allowed us to even consider such a thing, and thinking, how can we adapt to the needs of our society? I'll just, having said that bit, that important bit about the agency, I'll say that my expertise, in fact, is in historically in carbon science, again, in forest carbon science and capture both and transmission within forests and ecosystems. But my role in the Forest Service as the climate lead for the Forest Service, essentially, again, is to consider more broadly, how can our agency adapt? How can we be a part of society's adaptation to these climate solutions? I'll stop there and head back.
Thank you so much, Chris. Well, so since we're on the Forest Service, maybe let's start there. How does a carbon storage project on the U.S. Forest Service land differ from other developments such as oil and gas or renewables?
Yeah, I would say really in two key ways, really permanence and permitting. And so when I talked about us not even being able to consider the application of carbon storage in Forest Service pore space, that is because effectively when you're looking at 1,000 years, that is a permanent use, and our regulations don't allow for permanent use of Forest Service lands. And then permitting, of course, as you all know, when we're talking about carbon storage, we're not talking about the mineral estate, we're talking about storage in pore space. And so that's the surface landowner. In many states, that will be the federal landowner that has that conveyance and that permitting authority. So, so as we're thinking then about permitting carbon storage in Forest Service pore space, one of the things that we've done is to address that issue of permanence in our regulations to create propose to create an exception for carbon storage specifically, such that if there is a proposal to store carbon in Forest Service pore space, we can actually entertain that proposal if it passes our other criteria as well. Having then not been automatically rejected because of the permanence issue, we would be able to work with our colleagues and partners in EPA, who, as you know, would be considering the Class 6 well permitting or generating, doing the analysis for the Class 6 well permitting. We would also be doing NEPA for any above ground effects. And so the huge question that our public has regarding this, and you heard some of this in the last panel, is what are the conflicts with the service values? The Forest Service has a multiple use mandate. We were created to ensure a constant supply of timber and to protect water quality. And that expanded over the years to ensure that we're also balancing those uses with, say, recreation, with cultural values, with wildlife habitat. We have to ensure that everything we do is done with our trust responsibilities to tribal nations at the forefront. And so how do we then balance a proposal to store carbon with all of those things? And so in this proposed change to our regulations that we released several months ago into the Federal Register, this would not create an automatic acceptance of a proposal. The proposal, what it does is it gets past that permanence issue, allows us to work with the EPA to consider whether it meets the EPA's requirements for permitting, meets our requirements for those multiple use balancing with what we've got on the land. I really appreciated the last discussion in that panel because really a lot of the comments that we got on that proposed rule change were around potential issues related to how it might affect our surrounding communities, that whether directly or that are dependent upon the forests. And likewise, I'll also point out that there's a difference between having injection sites and supporting infrastructure on Forest Service land versus adjacent to Forest Service land, but using Forest Service pore space. Those are two massively different sets of considerations as we think about the criteria that they would need to go through to ultimately be authorized by the local official. I'll say that I've had colleagues from states before joke that the Forest Service hardly does ecosystem management, mostly it does process and planning. And I'll tell you, yeah, we do ecosystem management, but that process and planning, that helps ensure that our publics have the ability to comment and have interaction with the actions that we will take and affect and help direct the actions that we take. Likewise, that those actions are transparent. And so as we think about this for us, a brand new world of carbon storage in the Forest Service, it's critical then that we do engage with our publics and ensure that they know what we're doing, what the surface infrastructure is like and where it is, and what the science and possible ramifications are of the storage itself. Thank you.
Thank you. Anna, going back to something you said in your earlier remarks, there's more than one way to transport carbon dioxide. And often we think of pipelines, but there's rail and trucking. And so I understand Carbon Quest has a couple exciting projects in Washington State and I believe Colorado. And so I'm curious in those contexts, share maybe some of the exciting things that are happening with those projects and how you're tackling the transport piece.
Yeah, thank you. These are kind of two projects we're working on are very different in terms of transportation and just generally what they do. So in Washington State, we're just starting on a project it's a waste to energy plant and an incinerator. It's a municipal project, municipal waste facility. And so they are very close to they're a mile away from a disadvantaged community. Nobody wants it there, but they don't have a choice because that's where the trash goes. So we are helping them with doing their carbon capture, and the transportation there is really key because we can capture cost effectively. We've identified different ways of getting rid of the CO2 once we've captured it. The big question is getting it from the plant to those locations. We're somewhat lucky in the sense that that particular location is not far from a potential sequestration site. So we're hoping that that would be something that we can work out. And there are other industrials in the area that can all kind of pool into a sequestration site. I think what's nice about a lot of these carbon safe and other projects is that they are open to pooling from different industrial sources, which I think is important if you're going to attract some of these smaller industrials. There are also opportunities around, as I said, around concrete. There are a lot of new technologies in that space, and some of the other utilization that will permanently get rid of the CO2. So we're looking at different options there. The other project that we're just starting to explore it, but it's totally different and maybe interesting from that perspective here in Colorado. They're planning to or thinking about some very large greenhouses, so tomatoes, lettuce, and so on. And so those greenhouses, for plants to grow faster, you need CO2, but you also need heating and power for those greenhouses. And for very large greenhouses, you're kind of end up in a situation where you really want independent power, so like a cogen system or fuel cell, but you want it decarbonized, especially for new projects off the bat. So you can, so we have partnerships where we can basically kind of come as an attachment, if you will, to a fuel cell or a combined heat and power system that can just so we sell as a package with carbon capture. And in that case, you can actually just reuse the CO2 on site. So it's a really nice solution because for them, that also dramatically reduces Scope 3 emissions because right now, if they don't have the on-site use of CO2, they have to truck the CO2 all the way from either the Midwest or Texas because that's the only places where commodity CO2 is being produced. So they don't have a lot of options. So it's a nice circular economy story. And I would say every one of these projects has some interesting different vignette on transportation. But I do think that, and just generally what we do and where CO2 goes, I think the important thing for policymakers to think about is I think transportation is where we probably need the most help from state and federal governments. It's not the carbon capture necessarily itself. It's not even, maybe sequestration in some cases or utilization, but that bridge to the two between the emitters and the sites or the opportunities to dispose of the CO2. That's where I think we need more, more grants or more help and more kind of other thoughts and leadership from the policy side.
Can I just interject a little bit? So we've talked about, and I've heard it a few times, this idea that CO2 is a waste and it's going to be disposed of. I just want to kind of maybe give a little bit of a different perspective from that. And it kind of coincides also with what Chris was saying about pore space, and maybe I just want to kind of bring those two together. So states really have this ability. I mentioned it in my introduction that states really should be regulating this activity. And there's two distinct frameworks, right? And we want policy or regulatory frameworks that work, okay? There's waste disposal framework, We see that with the Class 6 requirements. EPA very much started with like a Class 1 hazardous, non-hazardous waste framework and then built onto that. So our Class 6 program, our Class 6 federal regulations are waste disposal. But there's a different framework out there. States like North Dakota, I think Wyoming is very similar. I think Colorado's looking at it. I think the states are all looking at a resource management framework, much like the way we regulate oil and gas. In other words, but instead of the oil and gas being the resource that the state wants to maximize, the pore space becomes the resource, and the CO2 has a value. That was talked a little bit about yesterday. The CO2 does have a value. North Dakota actually determines in their statute, I think other states have as well, that CO2 is a valuable commodity in that state. And so when we look at it that way, that's how we bring into pore space rights. We give most states, the surface owner owns the pore space. If the pore space is a resource, the state wants to maximize that resource, operators would need to define the pore space boundary, and that becomes a unit, much like the way we unitize our oil and gas resources. They force pool. Those mineral owners all are compensated across the unit, very much like we're doing with CO2 storage and pore space, where we're unitizing a defined area, and we bring in all those pore space owners share in that project, and they're all being compensated for that. So I just want to kind of give that out, put that out there, because I haven't heard it a whole lot. And those are two different regulatory philosophies that are actually really key, and we're seeing two of them. We're seeing them both play out in front of us today. On the EPA side, where the regional offices are the Class 6 permitting authority for all the states other than North Dakota, Wyoming, and Louisiana, there's somewhat of a backlog of permits. There's over 40 projects, well over 100 permits that are in this multi-year permitting process where there's some uncertainty to how long that takes to get a permit. But you see North Dakota, and I think you'll hear from Wyoming next, they have a defined permitting process where these permits can be issued within a year or maybe a little over a year. So just want to kind of bring that together. As we look at pore space, you can look at it like a resource, and then it's much different the way you regulate it.
Thank you so much, Kevin. And you actually segue really nicely into the question I was about to ask you, which is kind of related to the fact that in your opening remarks you said geology is king. Yep. In our last panel, we heard from Joey and Quinn, and they mentioned that there's so much data that exists already on geology. And given all these projects are starting to kind of take off, there needs to be a little bit more certainty with these projects and the timelines. You mentioned permitting certainty in your remarks, and yesterday you and I were talking about aquifer exemptions as a potential pathway as well. So what do you think is still not being done by the federal government, or maybe something that they can be assisting with better, if not for funding and looking at maybe permitting certainty or other sort of carbon storage expansions?
Well, I do think I think Class 6 primacy is extremely important, and we have states. I showed the map. We have several states that are pursuing Class 6 primacy. They're in the early stages. There's a lot that goes into the pre-application process from a state level. States have to decide what agency is going to regulate this activity. Typically, going to be your oil and gas agency or your Department of Environmental Quality, like Wyoming. States have to enact that statutory authority, and then states also have to adopt the regulations to show that to EPA as they apply for primacy that their program is as stringent as the federal program in protecting underground sources of drinking water, and that's the framework we're working in. Also, it's derived from the Safe Drinking Water Act, and it's all about protecting the environment, protecting our drinking water resources, which when we can look at aquifer exemptions, that's probably a term that maybe some that don't know in this room. Aquifer exemptions have been in place for decades. There's subsurface formations that are deep in the subsurface. Again, when we talk about geology, specifically CO2 storage, you have a dense phase CO2 where the molecule is packed in. You can store more CO2 when you put it under pressure and temperature. You have deep formations that maybe the water quality does meet certain drinking water standards, but it's deep enough, and there's shallower groundwater systems with abundant freshwater resources. So when we look at those deeper formations that maybe meet a certain criteria for drinking water, in other words, they could be treated, but it doesn't necessarily economically make sense to use those formations for groundwater or for drinking water or for municipal purposes, because there's shallower groundwater resources that are adequate. Historically, the different industries have used those formations using aquifer exemptions. In other words, they meet the definition of a USDW, or an underground source of drinking water. They're considered an aquifer, but there's an exemption there because you're demonstrating that formation will never be used for groundwater. It's thousands of foot deep. It's not economic to produce that water for drinking purposes. So typically, historically, industries have used that as a disposal zone because it meets all the criteria to be able to dispose of waste and also have other subsurface activities in those formations. When EPA developed the Class 6 rule, EPA prohibited aquifer exemptions for Class 6. So what that's doing is that's taking formations that are well suited and ideal for large-scale CO2 storage, and that's taking those off the table. Project developers can't necessarily target those formations, although they would be ideal, and they don't necessarily put drinking water at risk by any means. And so that's certainly that's an easy fix. It's a rulemaking, and that's a strike through of a rulemaking to fix that challenge that we're facing today. And I think it's an important. It's important because when you look at it from a logical perspective, a company can have a Class 1 hazardous or non-hazardous waste injection well into a formation and be disposing of a waste product, but at that same formation you can't use for CO2 storage. And so that's the situation we're in today, and that's an easy fix.
Thank you so much. I'm going to hedge my rights as a moderator and ask one more question before we move into Q&A. But this is more for everybody on the panel today. I'm curious if y'all have opinions on innovative financing mechanisms or incentives that can encourage the development of long-term geologic storage projects.
I'll start with just maybe a different perspective than you would expect from that question. In the Forest Service, our primary focus right now is coping with the wildfire crisis. And here we're in Colorado. I think you understand the need to cope with this crisis, one that is amplified by climate change. Now, there's practical ramifications of that, such as, in doing so, we are removing biomass, ideally removing biomass that has overgrown forests because we've been excluding fire from them for a century. The practical ramifications of that is we will just pile that and burn it in place, adding that CO2 right back into the atmosphere, unless we can find a source, or rather a sink for it. Ideally, as we're thinking about carbon capture and utilization, we can generate a massive amount of biomass from national forests where we are engaging in this reduction of hazardous fuels that generates generally wood that doesn't have an industry to take it. And so geology is king. This isn't going to be appropriate everywhere. It's not always going to be cost effective to transport it. But this is a time, really generational time of thinking outside the box. And so as we think about public-private partnerships, long-term contracts that can ensure supply of biomass to generate secondary sources and ultimately CO2, both as a commodity but ultimately be stored, hey, come talk to us. We're looking to get rid of a massive amount of biomass that we need to remove from our national forests.
I might one thing that I've mentioned now several times, but just want to maybe build on it a little bit, is using CO2, the utilization of CO2, and we've talked about maybe other utilization techniques, but for large volume CO2, significant volumes of CO2, the oil and gas industry will certainly use that CO2 and enhance oil recovery. And those reservoirs are suited to be able to take large volumes of CO2. We have a long history of those activities. And the way it works is, for those that maybe aren't familiar with it, you can take that, the oil and gas industry will purchase the CO2, take it to an oil field that's been going through this primary phase of production, maybe its secondary phase of production, and bring it into a tertiary phase. We have actually oil and gas fields that are unconventional that we think are actually going to take CO2 sooner. In terms of their ability to enhance oil recovery, but oil and gas production will go into terminal decline after its primary production. So you got to do pressure maintenance, and so you want to inject fluids in that reservoir to do pressure maintenance, and also to enhance the recovery of oil. In other words, the CO2 can be injected into the oil reservoir, and it enters into that reservoir. It comes in contact with the oil that is actually not technologically recoverable without CO2, and then it mobilizes that oil and brings that oil to the surface, and the CO2 actually replaces the pore space that oil was in. So you're storing CO2 in association with producing actually like a low carbon oil. And so the United States has a phenomenal opportunity right now as we look at deploying this set of technologies to put CO2 EOR very much on the table. Right now, the 45Q tax credit is incentivizing saline storage, and I'd like to see the field leveled. I'd like to see a level playing field, and also looking at the United States of America producing a low carbon oil through CO2 EOR. That's a real opportunity we have, and I think it just takes maybe some adjustments to the incentives.
And from the commercial perspective, so the two questions that we get asked most often is there space for your system in my plant or facility? And I can tell you if it fits in the Manhattan skyscraper in a corner of a basement, it will fit anywhere. And it does. We have 6 projects that are kind of we're modular, smaller systems, so they fit nicely in virtually everywhere. But the other question is the financing. So to date, we've had most of our clients just buy our carbon capture systems through their OpEx, but we now have a financing offer, and what we see clients ask sometimes is rather than purchasing a system or even leasing a system, they want to do this in kind of as a service, where it's essentially they are paying us a monthly fee for dealing with their CO2, and we have to do all the measurement verification, third-party auditing, but really we take upon us for that monthly fee to install the system, maintain the systems. We do 15-year maintenance contracts, and then do all the taking away the CO2, delivering it somewhere, and either disposing it or utilizing it. I would say the tax incentives that are helpful. I think there are 2 things that could be better on the 45Q side. One, so when we think of utilization, we don't think of EOR specifically. We think of concrete. Maybe in some cases, they're blending CO2 with hydrogen, and you can make an e-fuel out of it, or you can make a sort of a plastic displacement product. So it's instead of a petroleum-based material, you make a CO2 plus hydrogen material that works like plastic. So those things are not equal in the 45Q, so utilization gets less credit, less amount. So we would like to see that level out. I think also we really do need to figure out the rules around measurement and verification. I know there was a whole panel on it yesterday, so I don't want to get into that for too long, but I would just say it is important, especially for a carbon capture company that then takes it somewhere else where we're dependent on that someone else to, whether it is to dispose of CO2 or utilize it, that they know, what the rules are, that they can demonstrate what's happening. We can demonstrate what's happening with our system all the way to delivery, but we all need to kind of work together in that supply chain. And it's very important to have those rules that are clear and that are also fair and doable. And that's where I think we're maybe not quite there yet on the rules process.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much. And please join me in giving the panelists a round of applause. All right, so we'll be heading into the audience Q&A. Feel free to raise your hand, and Stephen and his colleagues will come in with the mics.
I'll be quick, or try to be. Hi, I'm Emma Tomley, Great Plains Institute. I guess as I'm thinking about the need for carbon capture across the US, we have a lot of heavily industrialized areas that aren't located near CO2 transport. So I'm wondering if you could speak to the interstate collaboration that's going to be needed to potentially transport CO2 via pipeline across states and across different counties, and how we can harmonize all those different regulations together. Thanks.
Well, I'll just say that not only do we need interstate collaboration, we actually need to get the distributors who know how to distribute CO2 through the commercial market, through the regular commodity market, educated about this kind of CO2 distribution. So if you're not doing it by pipeline, but you're potentially doing it by rail or even barge or truck, that market is completely separate from our little world here at the moment. And so we need to kind of bridge those two, because we can rely on their expertise on how to deliver products most efficiently. You can talk to a distributor and say, hey, I'm in Illinois, but I need to get the CO2 to Michigan or even further to New York. Like, how do I do that? What is the most effective way? What are the costs? What are the sizes of trucks? And what do we need for that? And how do we, by the way, do this in the most emissions conscious way, so we're not spending a lot of emissions in transportation? And I think that's where I hope that we see kind of bridging of those two markets, not just the states working with each other, because there is a precedent there that we should be able to capitalize on.
And I know CO2 storage and transport is maybe still maybe emerged and more of a topic, but I mean I think we can learn from our oil and gas industry. I think every chance we get, we should be looking to that industry, and that industry transports its product not necessarily to storage, right, but to refining, right? And so there's that separation of where oil and gas is being produced to where it needs to go to market, and we can learn from those industries in terms of common carrier pipelines and transporting CO2 to the geologic sink, right, or the storage site. We know there's about 5,000 miles of CO2 pipeline today in the United States. I know that there's predictions out there to double that or maybe 10x that. So we know we need to construct CO2 pipelines. And then we get into the issue that I think we're seeing play out today with acceptance of those pipelines and understanding landowner concerns. There's two real concerns that I've heard. I could be missing some, but the first one is eminent domain, where that's a challenge, because we're going through areas where we're saying that the carbon dioxide pipeline, in order to use eminent domain, that means the government is going to basically allow that land to be used for the public good or for a public purpose. And so we really need to identify, again, what is the CO2? Is it a pollutant and a waste that we need to rid ourselves of this product, or is it a commodity that needs to be transported to be utilized? And those are two distinct approaches to be able to use, to say, an eminent domain law if you needed to. Again, we want to treat landowners properly, and I think try our best to negotiate with those landowners so you don't have to use those laws. I think the oil and gas industry has been very successful at that. And then the other part is safety, and we just really need to have good material, good science-based, fact-based material out there to ensure people that CO2 pipelines are the safest way to transport large volumes of CO2.
Other questions?
Thank you. I want to go back, Kevin, to your comment about oil and gas and tertiary recovery.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the experiences we are having in California is, if we do CCS, that's going to extend the life of oil and gas industry.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people who have dealt with industrial pollution and issues around that not interested in that. So that's why they're opposing some of the direct air capture hub, fundings that have come to California. So I'm wondering, so this goes back to the whole point of like every state is different, every community has different priorities. But I was just wondering, like, as you're dealing with this in North Dakota or other places, have you also heard this, or is this something that's nuisance that nobody cares really about?
I actually hear the opposite. And so when we're looking at transport CO2 to just geologically store it, we actually have surveys in our state where we've surveyed certain demographics in certain regions, and actually there's a preference to have that CO2 go to enhanced oil recovery. Our state has seen the benefits of oil and gas production, and understanding that the oil and gas that we're producing in the United States, we have a very high standard in terms of environmental standards. And so we're producing actually cleaner oil in the US than we would if we were importing that oil, which we are and we will be for a long time, from other countries that don't have those same standards. And so we understand that as a society, we're going to need oil and gas for a very long time. And so why not have it be produced here in the United States in an environmentally friendly manner, and use the CO2 to produce that oil, and have it be low carbon intensity oil. There's some studies when we start looking at the life cycle analysis where you could have carbon neutral or carbon negative oil production.
Hey, Kevin. Hey, Kevin. Jonas Lee from Carbon Capture Inc. Do you have an idea of the range of the value for CO2 used in EOR? Like, what is it? I'm sure it's not one number, like $200 a ton or something like that as a break-even point. But you know what that range is by any chance?
I don't. It certainly is based on the price of oil, but right now there's a $60 a ton tax credit for the 45Q, and then for EOR, or CO2 stored within an EOR situation, and then the saline formation storage would be $85 a ton tax credit. So there's that $25 a ton difference, which I think is kind of right on pretty close to, I think, some of the historic numbers that we have. And I think that was maybe some of the reasoning behind having different values in the 45Q tax credit. But again, I think we have a real opportunity for efficient storage, as opposed to saline storage, where you're really injecting CO2 into a reservoir basically it's a reservoir that has salt water in it, where in the EOR situation you'd have production wells. You could really have more efficient packed in storage in an oil and gas reservoir than you would in a saline reservoir. So.
Amazing. Thank you so much. That's all we have time for today. And I invite you to continue the conversation after this during the break. But thank you again, and let's have a round of applause.